Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Track Outcomes webinar for the California Adaptation Forum's first track on advancing equitable adaptation. My name is Julia Kim. I am the Climate Change and Energy Program Director with the Local Government Commission, and I will be moderating this webinar. We'll likely see additional folks trickling in, but we want to save as much time as we can for the case study presentations and the panel discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started here. So first, want to thank all of our sponsors who made this year's CAF series possible, particularly to Southern California Edison as our champion level sponsor. So huge thanks to all of our sponsors, again, for your generous support of the California Adaptation Forum. We also want to thank our promotional partners for helping us bring in new voices and perspectives into the CAF community. We know that the adaptation space should involve as many people as possible, and sometimes it's tricky to bring everyone in. So huge thanks to all of our promotional partners again for helping to extend our reach. So as many of you know, the 2021 California Adaptation Forum focused on the Grand Adaptation Challenge. We're exploring key challenges faced by California's adaptation community and opportunities to overcome these challenges equitably, creatively, and collaboratively. And today we'll be sharing some key takeaways and case studies for our first track on advancing equitable adaptation. And before we dive straight in, I did want to take a moment to recognize our track facilitators, Jose Mock, Monica Palmera, and Nick Tipon. Faye, Monica, and Nick were the thought leaders behind the track's workshops, really always thinking about how we can design the workshops to be really interactive and how we can create meaningful opportunities for participants to engage with one another and connect, and also learn from on-the-ground efforts to advance equitable adaptation. So just want to take a moment to thank each of you for all your guidance and insights and creativity over the past 5 months. I also want to thank our partners over at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, Juliette Finzi-Hart and Nikki Caravelli, as well as the CAF planning team here at LGC, Kelsey Wolfcloud and John Vandervoort for all of their hard work and support. Yeah, it truly does take a village to put on a series like this. So thank you all again. So the track featured a kickoff webinar to kick things off. This webinar focused on grounding in equity and racial justice, different frameworks and principles. We also dug into COVID and racial justice lessons and how those can be applied to adaptation. And overall, we looked at how we can embrace uncertainty and look at how we can recreate a new normal. And at our first workshop, we explored how white supremacy shows up in our workplace and how it's affecting our work as adaptation practitioners. We also discussed strategies for dismantling white supremacy. Our second workshop focused on strategies for integrating equity principles and practices into adaptation, the practice of adaptation, and how we can actually work to realize those racial equity goals. And then at our third and final workshop, we dove into how we can balance the need to move quickly to meet the demands of climate change with a slower and intentional process of building relationships and embedding equity in our work in a meaningful way. Our participants also discussed strategies for inclusive community engagement, including for virtual events, as well as hybrid virtual in-person events as we seek to continue navigating this COVID recovery. So I wanted to take a little bit of time to share some of the key takeaways that emerged over the past 5 months. And after I run through these, Faye, Monica, and Nick, I'll invite you to kind of jump in. I'm sure I'm missing a lot, or if there's anything that you wanted to draw particular attention to. So first, the need to recognize how systemic racism is showing up in our organizations and in our work. Many of our participants shared how white supremacy is showing up through paternalism, perfectionism, sense of urgency, and the worship of the written word. Participants also discussed the need to revamp recruitment and hiring practices, as well as traditional budgeting and planning processes, and shared some strategies like level setting to ensure there's a shared understanding of definitions across their organization, or developing a diversity, equity, inclusion committee with both board and staff participation, and creating pathways for those who lack professional experience to join the climate workforce. Another takeaway that efforts to engage CBOs must be intentional and not performative or exploitative. We heard that many community-based organizations are experiencing severe capacity challenges with the influx of local jurisdictions reaching out for support. So one way of addressing this challenge could be developing partnerships that, one, of course, provide fair compensation, but then also structuring those partnerships to be longer term and not just for one-off projects and efforts. We also heard that intentional efforts are needed to co-create solutions, including for workforce development programs, so that we're avoiding the white saviors complex and engaging community-based organizations in implementation and not just for community engagement and to support planning efforts. Another key takeaway that there is a need to build capacity within government agencies in order to actualize racial equity goals. Capacity building is often focused on frontline communities and nonprofits and community-based organizations, which is true and very much so needed, but government agencies also need to build capacity to create inclusive and intentional processes that support racial equity goals. So some ways in which some of the participants are addressing this need include establishing standing equity working groups within their agency or organization to support peer knowledge exchange and ongoing learning opportunities, developing clear metrics for equity and environmental justice goals to track progress, and before doing that, actually explicitly calling out and defining what your racial equity goals or environmental justice goals are. Some are also establishing results-based accountability systems to identify effective intervention points that address root causes to then inform future action and future investments. And there are many participants who are working to operationalize racial equity into not just their strategic plans, but also their management plans, their mission statement, and the core values to hold their organization accountable. Community engagement efforts should not be overly prescriptive, and they should also create space to hear about other community needs and priorities. An overly prescriptive agenda can limit opportunities for community members to express their needs and priorities authentically. And some communities are in survival mode and cannot participate in organized events. And instead, we need to go into the communities and see what their actual needs are. We also heard that public education is also needed to enable community members to provide informed input. And last but certainly not least, trust is the foundation upon which all adaptation planning efforts and implementation efforts must be built. So while we know that there is great urgency to adapt to the impacts of climate change, our work can't be rushed, right? Building trust, repairing relationships, and creating authentic, lasting partnerships takes time. And building trust also means doing our homework. What has the community already shared with you or with another trusted community-based organization? What are the priorities and efforts that are already taking place on the ground? And not just doing our homework, but also following through and taking the time to educate and re-educate ourselves and our leadership. So I'll pause there for a moment and say, Monica, Nick, would love to hear from you if there's anything else you want to lift up in terms of key takeaways.
This is Monica. Julia, I think you crushed it on nailing the takeaways. I think you got it just right. I just want to emphasize for everybody on the line, thank you for joining, everybody. The first takeaway that you mentioned in terms of recognizing systemic racism in organizations, I think from the various workshops that we hosted and put together, I think that one in particular really resonates with me and is what I'm carrying forward after this forum in particular.
Oh, Monica, we lost your audio.
Sorry, I was trying to put something in the chat and I, messed up. But I dropped a link in the chat that was shared by the facilitator from that particular workshop about like specific ways that white supremacy shows up in our workplaces. And I definitely encourage folks to take a look at that if you haven't seen it before. And it just really, again, not to repeat you too much, Julia, but how, as long as these vestiges of white supremacy exist in our organizations, it will short circuit us in our even good faith best attempts to promote climate resiliency strategies in communities. And as a white person in my workplace, it's something that I know I want to take responsibility for and be really considerate about as much as possible. So I think that's one of the big takeaways I'm taking from this forum, along with the other takeaways you mentioned, Julia, and amazing practices we heard about from other folks we were lucky to have. And also want to thank Faye. Faye, you were the one that really encouraged this first workshop to be focused on our organizations and the racism that exists in our organizations. And I'm really glad we started with that because I know it's at least resonated with me throughout the rest of the series, that's at the core. So just wanted to lift that up a little bit more. Thanks, everybody.
Faye, Nick, feel free to jump in, but if you don't want to, that's totally
no,
okay too.
I think Lucy covered it pretty well. So those are good takeaways.
I think Monica did a great job of covering it, and would want to echo my appreciation for everybody who's helped with all of these.
Thanks. And again, huge thanks to Monica, Faye, and Nick for all their hard work over the past 5 months to make this series happen. I also want to thank all of the participants who joined us for the workshops. We had some pretty honest and frank conversations, time for reflection and time to kind of get real about some of the challenges that we're facing. I think ultimately what we found out is many of us, if not all of us, are facing some of the same challenges. So I encourage all of you to continue connecting, continue following up, continue working together and collaborating. It's going to take all of us to create the change that we need to see. So we're excited to have 4 presentations for everyone today. I'm going to go ahead and introduce all of our speakers now so that we can kind of keep the presentations a bit more streamlined and save some time for Q&A. So our first presentation will be on Black leaders of leisure at California beaches and the struggle for freedom during the Jim Crow era, the implications of their stories for our lives today. We're excited to have Allison Rose Jefferson joining us for this presentation. Allison Rose Jefferson's present research and professional interests revolve around the intersection of historical memory, the history of the African-American experience in Southern California during the 20th century, Great Migration and Jim Crow era, heritage conservation, and cultural tourism. Along with other work activities utilizing her knowledge, skills, and expertise, she has written a book, Living the California Dream, African-American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era. The places Jefferson examines illustrates a range of recreation and relaxation, production purposes, and societal encounters at beach and inland locations. So thank you, Dr. Jefferson, for joining us. We'll then hear a presentation on What's Rising, Transformative Climate Communities, Equity, Advocacy, and Adaptation in Action. Ivory Rose Kambeshi is a South Central LA native and blessed mama of 2 spunky daughters. These core identities inspire her commitment to racial justice, sustainability, and cultivating communities of opportunity, and love that affirm the worth and genius of all children and people. She currently serves in LA Mayor Eric Garcetti's office as Director of Neighborhood Initiatives for the What's Rising Collaborative. Thanks so much, Ivory, for joining us today. We'll then hear about Asheville's Climate Justice Initiative from Amber Weaver. Amber Weaver has been with the City of Asheville's Office of Sustainability since June 2015. Mrs. Weaver received her undergraduate degree at the University of Georgia for environmental economics and management, and her expertise is in creating policy within complex systems to uphold the pillars of sustainability. The City of Asheville's Office of Sustainability works to help achieve the city's ambitious carbon mitigation and climate resiliency goals while also focusing on climate justice. Thanks so much, Amber, for joining us from the East Coast. And last but certainly not least, we'll hear about the Disability Justice Culture Club's Resilience Hub from Patrice Strahan. Patrice is a core member of Disability Justice Culture Club, a collective led by and centering disabled and neurodivergent, queer, trans, Black, Indigenous people of color located in unceded Chochenyo Ohlone territory in deep East Oakland. The Disability Justice Culture Club has been involved in several projects, including the hashtag Power to Live campaign and the club's COVID response network. Thank you so much, Patrice, for joining us. As you can see, we have a pretty stellar panel. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Dr. Allison Rose Jefferson to kick us off with the first presentation.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much to the Climate Adaptation Forum for inviting me to participate in this program today. It's great that the organization is looking at various ways to get people engaged in climate adaptation, because it is more than just the science. It's also the social community aspects of it that intersect with the science to get people more concerned about what the scientists and the public policy people are thinking about. So my work as a historian and heritage conservation consultant is about recovering, documenting, and sharing suppressed and neglected stories of people and places in a practice of social justice. My recent book, that the title was mentioned, Living the California Dream, African-American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era, examines local stories of African-Americans who fought for equal access to California's recreation and relaxation offerings, excuse me, as they contributed to the broader US freedom rights struggle during the nation's Jim Crow era from the 1900s to 1960s. Leisure was not an optional add-on to civil rights. It was an essential component of liberty. And in the book, in addition to Bruce's Beach, which I'm going to focus on today, in Manhattan Beach, I examine other places that African Americans enjoyed for various periods during this era in Santa Monica's South Beach neighborhoods, Eureka Villa, which is now known as Valverde, in northern LA County, Santa Clarita Valley, at Riverside's Lake Elsinore, and Corona's Park Ridge Country Club, and a few other places. At these places, African Americans developed businesses and invested in real estate, even while discrimination and lax enforcement of California's civil rights laws that were established as early as 1893 many times prevented them from using various public or private facilities and buying land in many areas for decades into the 20th century. I show how these stories impact our lives today. Mostly relocating from southern states in escape of the worst of Jim Crow racism, African American migrants began moving in large numbers to the Los Angeles area in the decades surrounding the turn of the 20th century, joining a multi-ethnic community that included whites and people of color, along with migrants of many other backgrounds. They embraced the booster-promoted California dream of a lifestyle in picturesque outdoor offerings and new life opportunities. They were more self-confident and sometimes militant in demanding their rights as citizens and consumers. In 1912, entrepreneurs Willa and Charles Bruce purchased shoreline property to create a beachfront resort service business that became known as Bruce's Beach. This place between 26th and 27th Street off Highland in the city of Manhattan Beach was a very popular gathering place for African Americans of all socioeconomic classes on weekends and in the summertime. The successful venture spurred other African Americans to buy land and build cottages nearby. From the first days of operation, the Los Angeles Times reported many Manhattan Beach white supremacist residents, including city founders George Peck and Frank Doherty, along with their cronies, and by the early 1920s, some members of the Ku Klux Klan undertook private harassment actions and eventually legal sanctions to discourage African Americans from visiting and settling in the area. A proposal to take the Manhattan Beach North End neighborhood through eminent domain proceedings to create a park was submitted by private white citizens to the city council and was finally approved in 1924. It was pointed out at that time that if a park was needed, there was other property nearby that had fewer buildings that could be condemned with less trouble and expense. In the mid-1920s, this area was the most this area was almost uninhabited and the most remote from from the Manhattan Beach city section. After challenges to these proceedings that were unsuccessful, the evicted Bruce and other Black resort community property owners settled for the most favorable sale price that they could obtain. Whether they were adequately compensated for their land has remained open to debate into the 21st century. Racial prejudice aided by abusive use of state power eliminated the African-American residential and economic development of the Bruce's Beach establishment and small residential resort community, along with destroying Black beachgoers' social space with attempts to erase this site's memory from history. Only through political assertion has a limited revival of the history of Bruce's Beach and its incorporation into the public record emerged in the early decades of the 21st century. In their first organized civil disobedience protest action in the region, members of the Los Angeles branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1927 challenged Manhattan Beach officials when they tried additional measures to make the beach white only. Although the Bruce's Beach community was destroyed, the NAACP won clarification that African Americans had the legal right to enjoy this and all California beaches. This was an important civil rights and beach access victory, not just for African Americans, but for all Californians. The Bruce's Beach landholders and visitors were not alone in facing legal sanctions and private harassment actions discouraging African Americans from visiting and settling in particular beach locales as the region's population increased during the 1920s. There were confrontations and assaults across decades, some of which turned violent, aimed to bar African Americans from public beaches. Activists would continue to mount legal challenges to these discriminatory practices endeavored by whites. Finally constructed in the late 1950s, the park the park in 2007 was formally renamed Bruce's Beach to celebrate the African American pioneers that recreated and settled there. This was the first step to make the broader public more aware of the accomplishments of Manhattan Beach's African American pioneers, who, in spite of challenges, took action to develop part of their California dream and the leisure culture that would define Southern California identity and spread across the nation. Fast forward to 2020, Bruce's Beach became a site of consciousness and reflection for memorial and celebratory events at this time of global protest for racial justice. The idea of the Bruce family land being returned to their descendants emerged during this time period last year. Joining this moment of racial reckoning, Manhattan Beach residents have proposed new interpretive panels and artwork on the Bruce's Beach Park site the city owns to tell the story in a fuller fashion. The current Manhattan Beach City Council recently formally acknowledged and condemned their predecessors' racist land grab to force the Bruce and several other Black families out of the area, but they stopped short of formally apologizing. Meanwhile, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed Senate Bill 796 to allow Los Angeles County supervisors to return the beachfront property that they own to the descendants of Charles and Willa Bruce, from whom it was wrongfully taken in the 1920s. Elected officials have now opened up new ways of thinking about how to redress social injustices that have been that have not been looked at in the past. This particular situation is an example of what reparations could look like in California and across the nation in some situations. Some have said this would be the first land that would be returned to an African-American family by a government entity as a way to make amends for various discriminatory policies in California and possibly the nation. What Los Angeles County and state leaders are doing opens up new ways of thinking about how to redress and commemorate African-American social injustices that have not been looked at in the past. The Restitution Act of giving the land back to the Bruce's family could provide opportunities for recouping generational wealth building that was lost. It also provides some psychological healing for the loss of opportunity for the family descendants and for African Americans in general. These moves are a good thing, but we must think more deeply about events of 100 years ago and their legacy. This restitution will not provide tangible benefits to the purged African Americans of all classes from Manhattan Beach that lost out on their vibrant socioeconomic cultural space, where today they, African Americans, make up less than half a percent of the city's 35,000 population. For broader benefits to occur, our elected officials need to see to it that economic development, socioeconomic development programs are developed to encourage, that encourage African-American community opportunities in Manhattan Beach and at other California beaches. The renamed park, Bruce's Beach, has already created some community benefit in the identified sense of place in the landscape of America and the region that allows for a more culturally inclusive collective identity and social history encompassing a public memory. It is important to integrate the untold stories and more problematic, controversial, and sensitive aspects of our national experience into the national narrative as they show how the past influences the present and where we as a nation need to go in the future. The park name honors the Bruce's Beach pioneers and Black Angelenos in their ambitions and initiatives that challenge the era's white supremacist ideals and for their asserted determination to participate in socio-cultural, economic, amusement, and relaxation trends that were considered modern by the 1920s, and their broader visions of themselves and their community. The land return will hopefully join the Bruce's beach name on the park to honor the memory of the many African Americans who enjoyed the beach and struggled for their California dreams during the Jim Crow era and beyond. We, as citizens, activists, and there's, I'm sure, a few elected representatives here, have to continue to find ways to recognize marginalized groups and their heritage in Manhattan Beach and elsewhere through our intentional actions of inclusiveness and diversity for social justice, and not just talking points for the appearance of political correctness. Finally, these actions of commemorative, environmental, and social justice recognize that African Americans have a right to historical and cultural sites, a place in the American identity, and the joys of cultural expression and self-fulfillment, along with clean air, clean water, and the enjoyment of all of America's resources. Thank you very much. Also, I want to say quickly, shout out for my project in Santa Monica, the Belmar History Plus Art Project. I hope that you guys will take a look at that project commemorating, it's a social justice, commemorative justice project commemorating the African American heritage there, that in Santa Monica, they were able to maintain a community in Santa Monica, even with the challenges of the Jim Crow era. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Jefferson. I think many of us have heard the news, but actually hearing the history of how this came about has been really, really informative and really helpful. We'll next hear from Ivory, but before we do that, I completely forgot to run through some logistics. So let me just do that really quick, get it in. So we are going to have a Q&A session after all of the presentations. So we encourage folks to submit questions through the Q&A module at any point throughout today's webinar. You'll also see that there are options to upvote questions that you'd also like to see answered. And then feel free to use the chat. Everyone should have access to using chat. Engage in dialogue with your peers and with other folks who are on the call today. And then also feel free to chat John or Kelsey if you're encountering any technical issues or if you have any kind of back of house questions for us. And with that, I will pass it right on over to Ivory. And I believe, John, you'll get her presentation up.
Thank you very much, Julia and John and team, for the pleasure and honor to be here today. I'm not sure how I pulled the straw to go after Dr. Allison's presentation, but I'm gonna, try to rise to the occasion. And, on the face of the presentation, the contrast between hers and mine, it may seem disparate in a certain way, but I think Watts Rising, the community of Watts is kind of the epitome of what kind of happens when people are divested of the choice places to live. So I'll get to that in just a moment. Next slide, please. So thank you. So I'm speaking today about the Watts Rising Collaborative's Transformative Climate Communities Grant, which we believe in many ways is a model of equity, advocacy, and adaptation in action. Next slide, please. So Watts, California is a very, very dynamic community. There's a long history of diversity and migration. So while we have a long-time African-American presence that very much champions their history and their cultural preservation, many of us know that the history of this country started with indigenous people. So there was, indigenous people's presence in the community, Spanish presence in the community. From the Great Migration period, there was the presence of African Americans. And then we've seen drastic shifts in population with the larger Latinx population in the last few decades. So along with this dynamic population, there's also a rich history of community connection and activism, a deep well of arts and culture with the Watts Prophets, who many historians recognize as the creators of rap. Don't at me any East Coasters on the line, but if people shout out the Watts Prophets. Watts Writers Workshop, Simon Rodia, who's the famed artist behind the Watts Towers that you see featured there in the picture. John Outerbridge, an assemblage artist. Jane Cortez, a dynamic poet. And Nipsey Hussle is known to have taken some of his first music lessons at the Watts Towers Art Center campus. So a very dynamic community in that regard. And but the contrast to that is it's also a very distressed community. And for some of the reasons that Dr. Jefferson highlighted in her presentation, the covenants that restricted people from moving out of Watts westward, racist land use policy where metal smelters were allowed to be located very near to residential units, residential uses, as well as the fact that Watts is literally boxed in by some of the most egregious polluting sources. To the east is the Alameda Corridor, which transports trucks from the port to downtown for different centers and to commercial centers in the city. It falls right under the LAX flight path. There were activists who championed the construction of the 105 freeway, you know, saying that people on the west side don't have to worry about it. It's going to be located in this community. So the 105 freeway is to the south. And then on the western side, the 110 freeway is not too far from Watts as well. So that land use policy converged with housing policy, where in a 2.2 square mile community is the location of 4 public housing sites, with Nickerson Gardens being the largest public housing site west of the Mississippi. So, you know, someone in the 1940s or 50s who lived in Watts, you know, after their World War II job wasn't as lucrative, might have wanted to venture, you know, in other parts of the city, but would have faced some of those race-based restrictions that Dr. Jefferson highlighted. And that has repercussions too today. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the Watts Rising Transformative Climate Communities Grant frames some of this discussion, and I won't go into too much detail about the different parameters because I think most people are familiar with transformative climate communities. But the kind of the impetus or the underlying context that made Watts score so highly to be a recipient in round 1 of the TCC program was because of the astronomical levels of environmental pollution that it was exposed to, and how, you know, kind of rated highly in that area, which is kind of, you know, a mind trip. And then also having the young people suffering from high rates of asthma, mothers from low birth weight, you know, kind of laid the groundwork to be eligible for such a grant. Next slide, please. So the questions, you know, that frame this discussion are how do you incorporate equity into actionable strategies? Next slide. And I'm inspired and grateful to see the work that has been done before I became part of the TCC grant, and then the work that we're continuing to do now is very much rooted in the community. So while, you know, we as government actors who, you know, kind of sit in our, I would say our cubicles, but, you know, at our dining room tables and our Zoom meetings, you know, sometimes we think about how to connect or how to plug into the community, but sometimes the answer is not that. It's actually looking at what's already happening on the ground, you know, looking at what leaders are doing already, and then working in authentic, you know, collaboration and shared leadership to realize shared goals. So there's been a push and pull in Watts with, you know, the fact that residents have never waited for the government to do anything, you know, and have taken to the streets to raise their voices when injustice was happening, with one of the, you know, marquee incidents being the Watts uprising of 1965, which was partly in opposition to police brutality, but also reflective of the overall sentiment of a lack of resources, a lack of amenities, that people in the community enjoyed. So around this time, different community groups came to bear, with one of the major ones being Watts Labor Community Action Committee, which was founded shortly around this time. But since then, we've seen a number of different grassroots organizations lead. You know, we have the Watts Gang Task Force, which is about 10 years old, that really focused on gang intervention and youth violence prevention. Watts Clean Air and Energy Committee, which is a spinoff organization from Watts Neighborhood Council, with a wonderful mother and daughter duo that, you know, are the lead environmental justice advocates in the community. There was a Watts Century Latino organization, which was founded around the time where the community saw more migration of Latinx folks, and they wanted to be the advocates and the leaders and the people who would go to the mat for that community, which was growing but didn't see as much representation in leadership, in decision making. And then Watts Community Studio, which is a relatively recent outgrowth of a local researcher and public health professional who wanted to marry data with telling stories about the community and positioning the community to better advocate through data-based tools. So I feel like that kind of the push and pull coincided with conviction and courage from the government. So sometimes the government, maybe this isn't true, kind of just gets their act together and get it right. I guess that happens. But a lot of times is when residents push, you know, residents or interests or stakeholders push the government to be responsive. And a combination of that happened with the Housing Authority, you know, being more conscientious of some of the negative outcomes of the public housing sites. Councilman Booth Gaino was instrumental with using his platform as a councilman for the district to kind of call other government actors out. So he did an open letter to, I want to say, Mayor Villaraigosa and the CEO of the Housing Authority, and then also the mayor's office adjusting some of its policies and procedures to be more responsive to the community. And one of the questions is, how do governments or organizations change? And I think that's through listening and through matching resources with research. So the Housing Authority did its homework when it decided to redevelop the Jordan Downs public housing site, and it really made an effort to not repeat the missteps of other housing authorities in how they didn't build first, and people got displaced for a couple years while the new housing was developed. And then that research and that information gathering in partnership with the community created avenues to go after resources to do the redevelopment, to implement climate adaptation strategies. But it really worked hand in hand with, I think, the community doing a lot of the agitation and heavy lifting and visioning and, you know, showing up in meetings, advocating. Watts Century Latino organization in particular is a partner with the Watts Rising Collaborative, but the former program manager, Paola Ibarra, is, you know, has reminded me that Watts Century sued the Housing Authority at one point because of some life issues that happened there. So, you know, it's a matter of collision and collaboration. We hope the collaboration happens more than collision, but, you know, you have to listen, and then you have to be willing to take lumps that then can be used to turn into learning lessons to create better strategies that better meet the community's needs. Next slide. So just a couple examples of how to do that. Some of the strategies. Next slide, please. One of the ways is to create space for communities to shape projects, and then also being mindful to incorporate communities' ideas into project design. Next slide. So an example of this is the TCC grant in its you know, basic expression is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But the Housing Authority heard that something very important to community members is the preservation of art and culture. So in designing the TCC grant, you know, we could have just done pedestrian cyclist mobility, access to safety improvements, you know, through sharrows and buffered lanes, ADA ramps, et cetera. But some years prior, the community went through a lengthy visioning process with the National Endowment for the Arts, Our Town grant, and then they came up with something called Destination Watts, which created a lot of art installations that would highlight the history and culture of Watts. So while, you know, we couldn't do it at the full level of vision that the community charted in this plan, we were able to use this grant as a tool to activate something that the community had come up with. So that's just one example where your priorities don't have to be mutually exclusive from a community that may be more interested in a different priority at the moment, but you're trying to accomplish climate adaptation goals. Next slide, please. And I have no idea of my time, so if somebody can kind of drop that in there, if anyone was tracking it.
Yeah, I agree, just a couple minutes, but yeah, maybe in a couple minutes if you want to start wrapping up, that would be great.
Okay, sure. So another example that I'm particularly, you know, thrilled about is the fact that we have a street team. So instead of, you know, the housing authority or the mayor's office being the mouthpiece or the shaper of the project, we have the benefit of having residents from the Watts community, from different walks of life, different backgrounds, different connections to the faith community or to the school communities. And they really serve as the shapers and influencers, designers, communicators of different aspects of the Watts Rising TCC project. And then as a supplement to that as well, we have a community advisory group where we on a monthly basis, well, actually twice monthly, dialogue, interact so that we are responsive to the needs of the community. Next slide. Next slide. So on a monthly basis, we have a public forum where we take time to solicit feedback, to get beat up a little bit. You know, it's not always kumbaya. You know, we take our lumps, like I said before, you know, but that's sometimes the conflict or the tensions is how you get to a better state of collaboration and really humility to be responsive to the community. Next slide. So this is a picture of our public forum. In the background talking, you'll see Jenny Scanlan. She's one of the main drivers of the TCC grant at the Housing Authority. Next slide. And we also take great care to celebrate wins. So as you'll see in the next slide, at one of our monthly public forums, we didn't just do the work of planting the trees as part of the grant, but we also took some time to celebrate the efforts of the residents who were employed in the jobs to be the urban forestry crew that planted the trees as part of the TCC grant. So it's important that the urgency question comes into the mix here because yes, we are in an environment where we need to make a difference to reduce the temperature of the planet. But when people are just kind of seen as cogs in the wheel and they're not celebrated and appreciated and highlighted for their contributions, they may not want to stay plugged into the process. They may, you know, continue to focus on the bread and butter issues that are more pressing in their own lives versus, you know, reaching the goals of adaptation. So it's very important to celebrate wins. Next, you can advance 2 slides and then I'll just quickly do this last one. So these are certificates that the councilman's office provided to celebrate our urban forestry crew. Next slide. So I put a question mark near urgency because that's a relative term. And, you know, when folks are reeling from a pandemic or when folks, you know, have basic concerns about their children getting to school safely and not having to step over potholes or, you know, dodge gang violence, you can't impose, you know, like we've had situations where we had to stop programming to address a community issue, or, you know, we had to be mindful of when there's been upticks in violence and, you know, put an advisory out to project partners that maybe, you know, you have to pause your programming for now. So this is not easy to say, but you kind of have to go at the pace that the community dictates if you are authentic and true. And another key element is humility, to not think that we're the smartest people in the room, to not think that just because we learned about recycling in our BA programs that we know more about the day-to-day recycling habits or the ways of old that people have been doing for centuries. So I think that's important, that we don't, you know, come down from on high to wag fingers and say, you're not doing something right, but we honor local expertise and we elevate community solutions to problems. So I think I'll stop there, just in light of time, and maybe if some of the questions are asked in the course of the Q&A, I can, you know, add to that.
Great, thanks so much, Ivory. I know so many of us have been hearing about Transformative Climate Communities program, so seeing like a local project in action is really exciting. I definitely encourage folks to submit questions through the Q&A module. Otherwise, we will keep things moving along, and next up, we'll pass it over to you, Amber.
Great, thank you. Appreciate the offer to talk to you all about the work we're doing around climate justice in Asheville, North Carolina. Just to sort of set the stage for those of you who may not be familiar with Asheville, we're a small town of 94,000 people tucked into the mountains of the Blue Ridge. And we have a really great, vibrant city. It's a tourism city, but we also are aware of the need to be addressing climate justice from the lens of our frontline community members. So in January 2020, Asheville City Council declared a climate emergency. Resolution 2025 states that a climate justice plan be created to consolidate the various separate sustainability goals and department initiatives. Just roughly, the City of Asheville's Office of Sustainability oversees about a dozen different climate mitigation and resiliency work around food policy, waste reduction, energy. So this gave us an opportunity to consolidate those goals, have a look in figuring out how to consolidate the sustainability goals and the department initiatives. The adopted resolution acknowledges the urgent need to combat climate change, the many existing, again, relevant resolutions and goals, and the disproportionate impact of the climate crisis on Asheville's frontline community members. In 2018, the City of Asheville presented its Asheville Climate Resilience Assessment. It was included in the adoption of Asheville's comprehensive plan, Living Asheville. Through the work of the Climate Resilience Assessment, Asheville's climate threats and hazards were identified. And what you see here in bold print are Asheville's threats and hazards. On the next slide. Thank you. Here, our Office of Sustainability worked with University of North Carolina's Asheville's National Environmental Modeling and Analysis Center to determine how Asheville can become more resilient to environmental changes. Asheville's Climate Resiliency Assessment helps the city be prepared for and hopefully lessen the impacts of future extreme weather events due to climate change. Resilience is about investing before the hazard. That is the dashed green rectangle box. Investing in the right amount in the right vulnerable areas will allow our community to reach a higher baseline, and therefore in the event of a disaster, we won't drop down as far and be able to bounce back more quickly, thus building resilience. So as the Office of Sustainability embarked on the path of the concept of climate justice, it was important to look at the work that was already addressing this important issue within the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. And that's the network that sustainability professionals have and utilize to be able to work with our peers and for peer learning, and also a safe place for us to really be able to, you know, dig in and figure out these complicated strategies that we're trying to implement and resolutions we're trying to uphold. Through staff training, we know that our frontline community members, our BIPOC members, are those voices that are heard the least. We also know that sustainability voices lean toward white wealth, and it's imperative that in order to work on climate justice, that the office incorporate those voices of our community members that contribute the least to climate change and yet are most greatly impacted. Through the Government Alliance on Race and Equity trainings and one-to-one equity coaching, the office felt it necessary to interview others within the network that are embarking on similar work, understand lessons learned and how Asheville might improve the process. What we learned is that we too are members of our community that come from a place of privilege. And in order to properly address and define climate equity, we needed to hear from BIPOC members of Asheville. I'd also like to point out that the office received grant funding from USDN to help pay frontline community members for their participation in the city's climate justice initiative. Here on this particular slide, what we essentially learned from other cities interviewing them is, you know, if they had to do it over again, a lot of their work in defining climate equity and the work around climate justice came from these predominantly white privileged community members that have the opportunity and the time to be on sustainability advisory committees. So we wanted to make sure we were going out into the community and having our community members help define our work that we were doing. On this next slide, you can see here in April 2020, the office entered into a contract with Marisol Jimenez of Tapiac Consulting, a minority woman-led local business, to develop and conduct listening and learning sessions with BIPOC leaders and community members. Also in collaboration with these voices, the office seeks to begin shaping locally relevant definition of climate equity. The Climate Justice Initiative seeks to identify and support BIPOC leadership and communities to define climate equity within the city of Asheville and inform the direction of climate resilience action. Climate Justice Initiative ensures that frontline communities play a central role in the just transformation of systems that have been established and continue to perpetuate the unequal burden of climate impacts. The first part of the work, as we mentioned, were the listening and learning sessions. This report was synthesized of findings from a series of one-on-one interviews with 12 BIPOC leaders living and working in and with frontline communities throughout the city of Asheville. When participants were asked to reflect on what community resilience has meant to them, they described communities that are self-sustaining with strong support networks, which are deeply rooted in relationships. Community members described the 3 pillars that make a community self-sustaining as economic power, healthy environments, and strong social networks. Go on to the next slide. Another part of our work was around story circles. And what we were able to do here was utilize the data from the climate resilience assessment and also compile data from some additional areas that we felt gave us a perspective on the lack of equity that exists in our city. We use the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, as well as our redlining information, our racial demographic data from Buncombe County at the census block level. That was to, again, elevate Black and Brown community members, our minorities. And also we included Rocky Mountain Institute's energy burden data. Go to the next slide. Here is the city of Asheville's racial dot map. The blue areas here are our white residents. And I think it tells a very telling story of who lives here and who has access in our community. The next slide is the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, which includes socioeconomic status, household composition and disability, minority status and language, housing and transportation. You can go on to the next slide, please. We compiled this data to create a data map that lets us know and identify our most vulnerable communities. Those are the communities that we wanted to come in and do story circles with. So through the process of creating a climate justice data map, the city was able to create an index to help visualize and understand local climate threats alongside compounding social and economic stressors. This map is one tool helping staff define, discuss, and address climate resilience through equity. A working definition of climate equity is having access to information, relationships, land, and resources needed to have sovereignty and self-direction in response to climate crisis events and long-term sustainability that is community-led, deeply informed, organized, prepared for rapid response, and well-resourced. So very similar to what we heard from Ivory's presentation. I think it's quite telling, you know, to be all on the opposite end of the United States and hear similar reports from our most vulnerable community members. Through this process, the city identified the following neighborhoods, and that's fine, you can go to the next slide. Shiloh is one of the neighborhoods that we identified. And so this is an example of a map that was developed by Karen Hanna in our community. She's a graphic artist and are being shared with the neighborhood residents through these story circles. So, you know, really showing the climate stressors that exist in their neighborhoods and these vulnerabilities that were identified. The story circles involve creating neighborhood-based maps, outlining specific climate threats in each of our 4 neighborhoods that we identified were Shiloh, Emma, Pisgah View, and Deeper View. Because of the large concentration of Latinx residents living outside the city limits in neighboring Emma community, it felt critical that their voices be included in this conversation. It should also be noted that the same communities have also been amongst the hardest hit by the public health and economic impacts of the COVID pandemic, as well as a year of trauma and social uprising against structural racism. COVID outbreaks, protests, and conflicts with the city of Asheville and ongoing economic and housing crisis has made community organizing especially challenging and certainly slowed down our work. Not only in bringing climate to the top of organizers' priority lists, but also because both of our organizers and their communities are actively grieving and struggling while doing this work. The final component on this next slide is our youth artist empowerment. We will engage with youth around climate change in local communities through digital media and public art installation. This cohort of BIPOC youth artists will also be connected to national network of climate activists, scientists, and working artists to deepen their intersection of climate activism and cultural artistic organizing. Youth will utilize current digital tools merged with in-person story sharing to create a meaningful public art display centered around climate justice and equity, centering vulnerable communities by sharing their stories and images through the faces of change. Final images will be collaged into a unified fine art piece presented in public and also made available for purchase and for the funds to be given back to these youth artists that participated in this work. And the final slide talks about next steps, including utilizing feedback from frontline communities to help create a screening tool to overlay city plans and policies. If you are familiar with the GARE model toolkit, there's a step within the toolkit that talks about reaching out to our communities members. What we have found is, one, our Black, Indigenous, people of color have repeated their needs over and over to the city, and there haven't been significant changes. And they're also oversaturated with information, and just really fed up with being asked this question over and over again. So the hope is to create this screening tool so going into the Shiloh community, for example, that they're looking for green economy and wanting to make sure that the project doesn't cause gentrification or will address gentrification in some way, shape, or form, or giving back land. So that will be the purpose of the screening tool that we're trying to create through these interviews, essentially pulling themes heard from community members and youth and applying them as an equity voice when implementing plans and policies. Other examples might include reparations. We plan on forwarding this work into our reparations committee so that they too can hear these community voices, our frontline community voices and the needs. Again, there's lots of plans that the city has, like many other cities. So we're hoping to be able to create this lens. In addition, I think there's a lot of work around emergency planning. Here on the right, you see some work that was done by the Ashwa-Buncombe Food Policy Council on emergency kits and supply lists and food resources. So we want to make sure that that work that's happening in our food policy space is also going to be folded into the work of our climate justice initiative. So with that, I will stop and we can move on to the next speaker. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Amber. I have so many questions, but I'll just say overall, it's great to hear from a city outside of California, even though it's a California Adaptation Forum. And I think you put it well. Yeah, on opposite ends of the country, for many of us are still experiencing some of the same challenges. So looking beyond the state, beyond our existing network to see what other communities are doing, I think there's a lot of inspiration that we can find. Without further ado, Patrice, we'll pass it over to you for our final presentation. Let's hear about the work that you're doing.
Hi, thank you. My name is Patrice. I'm one of the core team members of Disability Justice Culture Club. Thanks a lot for the invitation, and thanks a lot everybody for wonderful presentations today. Today I'll be sharing about two of our community efforts, Power to Live and the Volunteer Resource Network. First, I'll talk about DJCC's origins, then what community and practice can look like for us, next Power to Live, and finally the Volunteer Resource Network. Disability Justice Culture Club is a collective led by and centering disabled and neurodivergent QT BIPOC located in unceded Chochenyo Ohlone territory in Deep East Oakland. And here are photos of DJCC members and friends at a direct action and 2 pictures of some donations. We work towards liberation by cultivating connections and community spaces that empower. We achieve this by sharing resources, building relationships, and wisdom sharing in all directions. We value the importance of interdependence with other communities while also creating spaces of belonging for our own communities to be empowered to lead our way towards liberation together. So DJCC was founded by Stacy Park Milburn, the late Stacy Park Milburn, who passed away in 2020 in May. Our first formal meetings as a group were in 2020, though through association with Stacy, we were active earlier. Stacy was active in disability justice activism and advocacy for many decades and engaged in cross-movement collaboration. Here's a picture of an anti-police militarization protest march with Stacy and a disability justice contingent. She also worked with Max Airborne and Max's Fat Liberation organization called Fat Rose on the hashtag Nobody is Disposable and hashtag Power to Live campaigns. And here are pictures of Stacy and Max at various protests with friends. So Stacy created Disability Justice Culture Club as a disability justice community hub, giving us the tagline, Revolution and Chill, that captures the blend of movement work, connection, support, and empowerment. And so here's an image of the book Skin, Tooth, and Bone by the DJ collective Sins Invalid, which Stacy had been a part of. They created the 10 disability justice principles our work is framed by, which are intersectionality, leadership of the most impacted, anti-capitalistic politic, commitment to cross-movement organizing, recognizing wholeness, sustainability, commitment to cross-disability solidarity, interdependence, collective access, and collective liberation. A disability justice framework understands that all bodies are unique and essential. All bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. We are powerful, not despite the complexity of our bodies, but because of them. All bodies are confined by ability, race, gender, sexuality, class, nation state, religion, and more, and we cannot separate them. So to join in DJCC's work, experience was not required. Our own lived experiences were, as disabled people, are valid and valued. And here's a picture of a mixed group at the DJCC house preparing for a protest. And here's a quote from Stacy: "I want to leave a legacy of disabled people knowing that we are powerful and beautiful because of who we are, not despite it." Here are some pictures of some cross-movement orgs that we collaborate with, CRC and Image for Oakland. As a disability justice resilience hub, we're members of Northern California Resilience Network. Mutual aid, as defined by Miriam Kaba and Dean Spade, is work to meet each other's survival needs that's based in a shared understanding that the systems we live under aren't going to meet them and are actually causing the crises. Mutual aid is not transactional, charity, or a reason for social safety networks not to exist. And here's a picture of a mixed group of friends at a mutual aid birthday party. Power to Live was initially created by a group of disabled friends, including Stacy, who were trying to figure out who had what and who could go where during the wildfires and power shutoffs. They created a social media campaign, a mutual aid network, and joined a coalition led by the utility justice organization Reclaim Our Power to organize an action at PG&E. So here are some screenshots of Reclaim Our Power's homepage and some Power to Live Instagram posts. And then here are some pictures of the protest and rally that was at PG&E headquarters in 2019, December in San Francisco. And here's a group of us working with Power to Live. So in response to COVID, we began another aid network. Here's a picture of a DJCC resident filling sanitizer bottles for distribution. At certain points, the support provided to requesters ranged from purchasing and delivering groceries and medications to helping with light housework, offering regular check-in phone calls, to providing support to help offset the financial burdens exacerbated by the crisis. Some of the programs have terminated, and now we're working to determine how we can transition them so they can continue. And it's sometimes it's a volunteer resource network, a little bit more so than mutual aid, because there's leadership by the DJCC core team and disabled volunteers that put requesters in touch with support volunteers. Some of the core members created webinars to come together to share wisdom, and here's an ad for one of the webinars that was held. And the Volunteer Resource Network has been in operation since March of 2020, and we received hundreds of requests and hundreds of offers for support from volunteers. Some challenges have been working with and within systems where values differ, dealing with urgency and burnout, and also dealing with conflict and the challenges of collective work. Some victories have felt like just the impact and being able to connect with organizations and individuals. And as we move forward, we aim to focus on ways to establish more clear boundaries and co-create protocols and collective decision-making processes and prepare for generative conflict and expand our community building. And in terms of policies that help community aid work, it feels essential to center access, to eliminate barriers to direct support, and to not impede the most impacted communities from leading our way, making our decisions, and deciding our metrics for success. And then here are some photos of some donations we were receiving and volunteers helping with donations for distribution. And then here are some resources that were found supportive. The work of Stacy, some of which can be found at #Stacy Taught Us syllabus at Disability Visibility Project's website. The work of Sins Invalid, including Skin, Tooth, and Bone. Leah Lakshmi Piepsnes Amarasina's book, Care Work. Dean Spade's lectures and written work, such as his book, Mutual Aid. Miriam Kaba's lectures and work, including her books, Fumbling Towards Repair, and We Do This Till We Free Us. And thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Patrice. I think that's one really inspirational, incredible example of how so many grassroots organizations have been coming together and forming by community members to meet community needs through mutual aid. I'll leave it there so we can save as much time as we can for Q&A. Looks like we have one question for Amber, but I'd actually like to open it up to all of the speakers, as I imagine there might be other perspectives to share. So it's from Alexandra, kind of touching on the community fatigue with needs assessments, hoping speakers can kind of speak to how, like, ways in which that can be avoided. So Alexandra's thinking about trade-offs between assumptions about people's needs, like a vulnerability map or using a prior needs assessment, and balancing that with direct representation that may be repetitive or redundant. We've actually been hearing from a lot of our participants throughout the series that community fatigue is real, especially with COVID, with the pandemic and other ongoing challenges that have been constraining capacity. So Amber, if you wanted to kick us off, and then we can open it up to hear from other presenters.
Sure. It's It's a hard question. It's one that I think we continue to work on with our communications team. What I am hoping for is the screening tool, these themes that are being pulled from these interviews. We'll be creating additional questions from the themes on how we're, for example, we know for sure green economy and just economy in general in many of our frontline communities. So how is it we can go in and build sidewalks and hire community members to be the ones to get information out on a public meeting, or hire community members to help us organize if need be. Really thinking about how we can involve our community members and not going back to ask the same questions, but to say, we heard you and here are the needs, and you tell us what you need from this project. I also think that, I was going to say something and I forgot it. I'll stop there so somebody else can also speak, but in a nutshell, still working on it.
Thanks, Amber. Allison, Ivory, Patrice, anything to add here in terms of community fatigue, community engagement fatigue? Is that something that you've been hearing as well? Do you have any advice to share with our participants today?
Sure. One of the strategies that we implemented, which was non-implementation, at the throes of the pandemic in the summer, in the spring and the summer of last year, we had the decision about whether to continue our monthly public forum that until that time we had met in person, on a monthly basis. And we could have, like many groups, transitioned to Zoom to try to continue to host our sessions. But then we realized, parents were trying to get their kids on Zoom. Various services had transitioned to Zoom, and was it reasonable to expect community members to attend yet another Zoom session? So we decided to pause our public forums for a while and instead go to other community meetings. And I didn't get to that portion on the slide, but we have this dance of like expecting people to come to our meeting versus going to where people are. So instead, we kind of just went on the meeting circuit, the Zoom meeting circuit. So, I was on a Watts Neighborhood Council meeting until 11:16 one night, because it was a commitment to be present, where community members were. So that's one strategy. Another one is, I don't know if it's basic, but like read what is already on the books. I found out, late that there was this one project that's not a Watts Rising project, but that the community was strongly opposed to, and people at the city of LA approved this development project, and it was very clear that they hadn't really read plans that were community visioning documents that the community did for decades. So I feel like that error could have really been avoided if maybe there was a little more research and commitment to kind of seeing what already existed as the vision for that particular site. So another thing is, like, I know this can be hard for government entities to do, or people who have planning mandates. And I shouldn't even be saying this, it might be blasphemy because I'm a planner, an urban planner by training, and we have these mandates. But what about just not doing something? Who dictates that there has to be a quote unquote needs assessment, which philosophically that's kind of an issue too, like that there's thought that there's already a need, or like there's, I guess I'm trying to say it's kind of like a deficit perspective for one. And for two, what if you don't do it and think of other ways to get the information that you think you need, and I really like what Amber shared about hiring people, because that's the approach we've taken too, is our Watts Rising Street team members are paid staff members who who share feedback, who say, well, no, you shouldn't put the ramp there. You should put it there because that's where more people get off the dash bus and they need to, you know, have that safe access. So I think just in general, I'm rambling, but like, we don't need to just continue forth because this is what our mandate says, or this is, you know, what this timeline says, but have the adaptability, the adaptation to change course when it makes the most sense for people to do so, and then to actually meet the need. Don't do the assessment, like start the feeding program, or, you know, engage with people to have people more present on the streets if they feel that safety for their children is a concern. So it's a lot. It requires both and thinking, and not just doing business as usual.
Thanks, Ivory. I want to share another question. I'm actually just reflecting upon some additional themes that came through in the workshops, and you know, a lot like what we've seen out in the real world. You know, a lot of the solutions and big changes have been led through grassroots organizing, through the hard work of longtime environmental justice leaders. Similarly, what we've been hearing from participants, there are many people at the staff level who are really committed to racial justice, social equity, environmental justice, but they're running into some barriers or challenges in bringing their leadership on board, whether that's, you know, within the organization or the board of directors or elected officials. Any advice you can give to folks who are kind of running into some barriers and bringing leadership, the decision makers on board, to enable staff to then be able to kind of focus their attention and energy on advancing equity goals?
Well, in the city of Asheville, it was required that all staff members take an Equity 101 and 201 course, just so we're all using the same language, just to, you know, help think past yourself and, you know, your day's work. I don't know that that's helpful if you're trying to train your city manager or the mayor, for example. So this was more top down. That was helpful for the city of Asheville. I would also just mention maybe that I've been in 4 or 5 equity trainings, and each time I'm in an equity training, I learn something new about myself, and also I'm able to reflect on past experiences in a different light. I mention that because I think that we're not going to get this work right the first time around. It's going to take multiple iterations and years of letting go of white supremacy and retraining our brains to think differently. So maybe it's one of those things where, you know, you don't give up and you continue to work and, you know, push equity and inclusion. And in our case, you know, also sustainability, the importance of sustainability in that movement as well.
Thanks, Amber. Any thoughts from our other speakers, or any final words to kind of share with our participants as they continue their efforts to make their adaptation work more equitable, both in terms of process and outcomes?
Since Patrice or Allison didn't chime in, I'll say to that question, insider outsider orientation is very important. So I shouldn't say this since this is being recorded, but I sometimes have difficulty balancing my government bureaucrat hat with my activist hat. But because there's the need, you know, you have to use your influence in ways that get to the goals of justice. So if you have a particularly active activist group in your community, in what ways can you attend that meeting as a private citizen to share, as an anonymous person, what levers might be able to be pulled or pushed that can help those folks at the upcoming commission meeting be more informed and compelling in their ask or their demand. Another principle is like leading up or managing up. So what influence do you have in your given, scope of work where you might be able to embed the thought about the direction that your city manager might go into, or where you can use creative thinking to identify how their interest in this other policy area or a dimension of that other policy area can align with, like using their self-interest for this thing to converge with a more equitable driven policy initiative. So it requires some creativity and imagination and sometimes just courage to speak up and say, this isn't right, or maybe if you consider doing it this way, you can meet this goal of yours and then also meet the community's priorities. So that's just, some ways that I try to navigate that challenge.
So generally, I just want to say that as a historian who thinks of my practice as an instrument of social justice, I think that you policymakers here need to think about engaging more historians and scholars in your work because we have the data, we have the information that you can formulate to look at public policy and how to make things happen for people. And all of this has been, in terms of the different things that we're all striving for right through here, diversity, equity, and inclusion, agency in our communities. It's not like, this is just another wave of these kinds of experiences. And hopefully, in terms of this wave, we're going to have a greater advancement in terms of ways in which we can make our communities better, and that there will be a bigger jump in terms of more equity and inclusion. But some of the things that we're talking about today, okay, we've been talking about these things for multiple generations, and each generation has a different way that they are approaching it. And so we must remember that the struggle continues. It is never over, and we should look at some of the things that have been done in the past in a more thoughtful way in us moving forward for a better future.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ferguson. I can't, that sounds like the perfect way to wrap things up. We are running a little over, so I know that if we were gathered in person, we would be hearing such a loud round of applause that, our ears might hurt a little bit. But given that we're meeting virtually, I think I can speak on behalf of participants. Just this past hour and a half has been incredibly valuable, so informative. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us. For everyone who's still here, thanks for sticking around. We have our Track 2 Outcomes webinar tomorrow, our Track 3 Outcomes webinar on Thursday, and the full closing plenary webinar next week. I also wanted to flag the state climate adaptation strategy. While we were in this session, the state has released their 2021 California climate adaptation strategy, and it's out for public comment. So Wanted to flag this for folks if you didn't already receive this email. Hopefully you can engage in this process and join in on the informational webinar happening later this week. And with that, thank you again, Allison, Amber, Ivory, Patrice for joining us. Thanks to everyone, all of our participants for joining us, for track facilitators for all their hard work, John and Kelsey for all your support. And with that, we will all let you out of here. Thanks again and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Take care.